Hi, Bruno.
Hi.
Welcome to Stats 385. We're very happy to have you here. I'm personally very excited for your lecture. And so, as my beginning question, can you tell us about yourself and your current research in Berkeley?
Sure. So I work in the field of computational neuroscience, and we have a center at Berkeley called the Redwood Center for Theoretical Neuroscience, and it's basically a group of students, postdocs, and faculty, many with backgrounds from engineering and math and physics and so forth, trying to bring ideas from these fields to bear on understanding the brain, how neurons process information. So that's really been the goal of my own work for a long time, to try to understand what neural circuits are doing from a theoretical point of view, and what are their underlying computations, and working together with experimentalists to try to test these ideas.
Thanks. So I want to ask you, you're perhaps, well, you are the only neuroscientist giving a lecture in this course, in this quarter. So I would like to ask you about your opinion of convolutional neural networks, and whether do you think they're good, bad? What do you think of them?
Well, I think it makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's something we've been doing for a long time in the field, and if it matters what you're trying to do. If you're trying to sort of simulate how the cortex works, it's not a good model. But if you're just trying to do engineering and sort of learn a good feature set to describe an image, it makes sense to assume stationarity. That, if I learn a filter over here, I'm going to probably need the same thing anywhere in the scene, because these structures, the objects I'm looking at could appear anywhere in the scene. So I think from that point of view, it's an efficient way to do the learning.
In my previous conversation that we had over coffee, you alluded to the fact that things need to be added to these models in order for them to be robust. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I guess if you just sort of take the general idea of convnets and tease that apart. So one part is the convolution, right, in which you're just trying to be efficient in the learning. And then I think the other component is, okay, how do you feed the information from one convolution layer to the next? And one of the main paradigms that right now what's done is it's some form of pooling, max pooling or sum pooling or something like that. And to me, that's kind of like a turn in the wrong direction. I think the reason why people do it, and I'll talk about this in the talk today, it sort of originates from Fukushima's neocognitron. You're trying to capture this idea of invariance. You're trying to get a description which doesn't change as much as object features move around. But that's also a very lossy operation. And so if you just do that sort of straightforwardly like that, then well, you can obviously get somewhere, I think, as experience with these convolution nets shows, but you're also going to run into problems at some point too, because you're throwing away important information about relative spatial relationships. So I guess in my own research, what we've been working on is ways of taking into account that structure instead of just doing pooling, trying to preserve information about relative spatial relationships. And one is this idea of dynamic routing, which I'll also talk about.
Then you said you're going to run into problems. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, just so this idea of adversarial examples, that you can show deep network images that have nothing to do with a particular category, or just nonsensical images, and they'll report with very high confidence that it's an object, when it's just sort of garbage and something nonsensical. That a human would never make that mistake, and I think this is why they're making that mistake, because they're sort of treating the image as a texture, not as a shape. Right? They're not trying to model the object shape, it's sort of texturizing. And it turns out that you can get by with that for many kinds of tasks where all you want to do is categorize something roughly. Then that might be good enough. But if you actually want to know something about the shape of the object, or if you're a robot, you want to reach out and grab the object, figure out how to shape your hand to grasp it correctly, that's where you're going to run into problems.
Thanks. We also talked about your great paper in Nature that you have on sparse coding in this class, especially in the first lecture we talked about that. I want to ask you whether you see any kinds of relationship between deep learning, the way it's being done right now, and sparse coding that you were doing many years ago.
Yeah, lots potentially. So I guess one way of looking at it, I mean, what's really fascinating is that the solution you get from deep learning, if you look in the first layer, the solution you get there is very similar to what you get from sparse coding. And the approach we took with sparse coding was this from the framework of unsupervised learning and natural scene statistics, right? In other words, to say if you're living in the early stages of some sensory system, you're being bombarded with all this sensory data. One thing that would make sense is to figure out how to organize all this data in a way that expresses its statistical structure more efficiently. And this was Horace Barlow's original idea that he proposed back in the 1960s, and then later in the 1970s, this idea of sparse coding. And so that was kind of motivation. And then, if you look at the way Barlow writes about it, he says, well, this is a good thing to do because if you can provide a sparse representation of the input based on its statistics, then it's going to be in a format that makes it easier to do recognition or forming associations at later stages. That was never demonstrated, by him or by us in our work. We're sort of going with that idea as a hypothesis. Okay, this sounds good. Let's do this. Sparse coding sounds like a good thing to do. Let's just do it. See what happens. And then many years later, people like Andrew Ng used these sparse codes as the front end to computer, object recognition system, and show that that's actually a good code to use. And then now with deep learning, you're making no assumptions whatsoever. You just sort of let it evolve, and indeed, that's the kind of solution that evolves. So it's kind of, in that sense, it's sort of, one could see it as a validation of that hypothesis that one had to begin with. This is maybe why it was, that indeed it does have utility.
Thanks. And as my last question, you told me that you were an undergraduate at Stanford on this campus. So can you share with us a memory from those days?
Several. I guess that's where I first got interested in neural networks. It's where I found out about neural networks. I mean, I was originally interested in AI, but I learned about neural networks from Bernie Woodrow, and so that was like a really salient memory. Running at the dish, and some really great professors here, like Joe Goodman and Double E.
So which part of the campus was your favorite part that you would spend more time on that part?
More time, maybe like the quad, maybe, or area like the library, Green Library, and things like that. Yeah, and study. Yeah.
Thanks, Bruno. Pass it on to David.
So thanks again for being with us. I saw an interesting talk by Jan LeCun a few years ago at the onset of what I would call the deep learning mania, in which he said more or less in so many words that deep learning provided a universal feature set that could work with any kind of media content and solve any kind of task. So I considered this a rather bold claim, and I raised my hand, and when I was recognized, I asked a question. I said, Olshausen and Field many years ago just wanted to show that a particular feature set that they came up with was good for one task in one specific way on one specific set of images, and they got a paper in Nature that's gotten thousands and thousands of citations. If you're actually of the belief that you've got this much more inclusive thing, why don't you publish it as a claim to be evaluated scientifically? And he said, I never thought of that. I wonder if you have any comments.
Well, I think this has been one of the grand goals and aspirations of many researchers in neural networks for a long time, that we're going to come up with a killer app neural network, and it's going to be the solution to everything. And I share that some too, and especially in the early when I got involved in this field. So I can't blame him for being very rosy, optimistic like that. But I think. I guess my own view is that it's maybe sobered over time is that it's going to take a lot of engineering too. It's not going to be just like one right algorithm you can apply to all data in some feature set. We're going to have to think about a lot about the problem in different domains and the specific problems of those domains, and then engineer solutions that are efficient for those domains. And then the learning really is kind of like about adapting the statistics and making it optimal. But 99% of the work is really you as the scientist kind of trying to figure out how to structure this architecture correctly. And that's certainly true if you're trying to understand brains, how nervous systems work. It's not like there's just going to be one universal algorithm that explains everything in the brain. Who knows? Maybe there will be, but we'd all be shocked. I think there again, it's going to take a lot of very careful domain-specific thinking about why did biology come up with this solution, and what's it doing, and what's it telling us.
Well, to continue, I think what I had learned from your Nature paper was that the Olshausen field basis was something intrinsic to images, and it arose from the statistical analysis of natural images.
Mm-hmm.
And if I were looking at other kinds of media content, I might well find something very much unlike it. In which case, I might be able to publish that other thing as a new kind of intrinsic basis, expressing a new kind of media content that had not previously been exposed.
Mm-hmm.
So I would think people would be very interested in following in your footsteps, only trying to discover other kinds of basis functions for other settings. However, I may not know very much. And so I'm thinking that maybe you, of all people, would have been thinking about this for decades at this point. And maybe there are things that have already been published, or there are reasons that there's no opportunity of this kind.
No, I think it's a good task to undertake. Let's see. Maybe I could just unwind a little bit and sort of some of the original motivations from this approach. Like when people say natural images, that was really in contrast to the standard paradigm of the day, where in neurophysiology or psychophysics experiments, people would typically use test stimuli like gratings or bars or spots, and very simple kind of laboratory stimuli to probe the system. And the idea was that we have to be very reductionist to like this and understand kind of like the system one step at a time in terms of some kind of shape features. And David Field came along and said that actually, well, no, actually, if you just look at images, real images of the world, there are things you can say about the structure of them. They have sort of a universal statistical structure, things like the 1/f power spectrum or the sparsity you see in wavelets, coefficients. And that kind of came as a shock to people at the time, because I think the thinking was that every image is just going to be different. There's no one thing you could say about a whole ensemble of images of nature. And so that kind of got people thinking about that. And so in that sense, I think whether you're talking about like images of nature, trees and leaves and rocks, versus urban environments, is not such a big distinction, because both of those environments have edges, they have contours, they have sort of complex structure in them. It's like the whole idea is it's not a grating, something more complex than a laboratory stimulus. So I think that was kind of the original goal. And so we played around a little bit, like learning dictionaries from nature images versus urban scenes, and the solution does change a little bit in ways you might expect. Like in urban scenes, the dictionary elements look more elongated and sort of more edge-like and things like that, more sort of biased towards horizontal and vertical and things like that. So we didn't ever do anything systematic like that. Actually in some work I'm going to be talking about today, so people like Oda Liva and Antonio Torralba looked at sort of different scene types, like scenes of, outdoor scenes, indoor scenes, and sort of characterized in different ways. And they look at those different statistics in terms of the power spectrum. So it'd be interesting to sort of look at those same categories of images, I think, in terms of like sparse coding. What are the differences that emerge? But I don't know that anybody's done that yet with sparse coding. There's actually another piece of work along that line, so that Mike Lewicki did with Taewon Lee quite a few years ago, where they looked at a mixture model, like a mixture of ICA models, where you can train now on an like a mixture of nature scenes and text images of text, and you just throw them all in the same training set, and then you train this model. So it has sort of two ICA models in it that can learn two different dictionaries, and then they show basically it learns one dictionary for text and another dictionary for the nature scenes, and it sort of decides, it can sort of choose which to use for any given image patch. So I think that was an interesting step along those lines. But I think maybe like in the context of deep learning, what people are using now is they just sort of have a big heterogeneous pile of images, and it's all just kind of mixed in there in all the first layer filters, just everywhere. It's kind of sort of distributed out. So I think somehow maybe if you could think about categorizing those, you could have something like a mode switch in the network that says, okay, here I'm in an urban environment, now I'm in a nature environment, now I'm in an aquatic environment, or something like that. And so I'm going to switch my dictionary that I use in the first layer accordingly. That might be something that helps.
So this connects to what you've just been talking about. So I remember reading at the time these papers that were talking about the importance of carefully collecting scenes of natural images, and for example talking about human primate origins, how humans would have seen green predominantly in deep jungles, how foliage would have been so important, and trees and so on and so forth. And so the human visual system might be specially adapted to features that could be picked up if you went and took pictures in the woods, for example. So in collecting your data, you might be very, very careful about choosing the environment, et cetera, et cetera. So I remember all of that. I remember that in your paper and some of the others in the mid-90s, people were quite scrupulous in talking about the ensemble of images and its composition and how it was collected and so on and so on. Then along came Fei Li and ImageNet, and the basic idea was the web is full of images, let's just scrape everything we can find and throw it all in a big pile. And then people analyzed that, and in 2012 they showed some success by deep learning, and people announced that this was the new reigning research paradigm. Just scrape whatever you find out there and develop a model on it. Do you have any comments?
Well, I think, again, I think it sort of depends on the goal. Like, what are you trying to do? If you're, that's probably a great a great way to proceed if you're a researcher at Google, and they're just scraping tons of images off the web every day, or Facebook. All these images are coming in, and so then what you're really interested in is what are the statistics of images on the internet, so for that purpose, maybe that's the right thing to do. But if you're trying to understand biology, right, adaptations in the nervous system, what environment did we adapt to, and what are important, what are the important features of those environments, then I think you'd want to really sort of separate out these different ensembles and study them, or trying to characterize their differences somehow.
So the fact that on such heterogeneous data they're finding what looked to the naked eye qualitatively like the Olshausen field basis suggests there's a great deal of robustness to that basis.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which I think your earlier comments also pointed to. Is there something more formal that we could say?
That's a question for you. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how it'd be interesting to think about how to approach that. So one of the examples I think that was very instructive to me early on, that it was from David Field, where he just showed the scale space, the structure of scale space for a fractal contour. So if you just take an image, a black and white image of a fractal contour, and just look at the scale spaces. You have XY going this way and the scale going down. And as you move through scale space, the energy sort of wanders around that space in a very complex and unpredictable way. In comparison to if you just had an image of an edge, like a single straight edge, then the energy just moves around in a very predictable way down in scale. And that was one way of motivating why you want a multi-scale code. And previous to that, previous to David, I think one of the ways people thought about it, why you want multi-scale, is that you have different kinds of edges. You have sharp edges and you have smooth edges in the environment. And I think that point of it, in David's example, was that even if you have just purely black and white images, all sharp edges, you still get this multi-scale code as an optimal solution. So it has more to do something with like the structure of contours, right, and things like that. So. And certainly in natural environments, you have more of these fractal contours present, and maybe in more urban environments, you might have fewer of those. I mean, introspectively, that seems kind of reasonable, but yeah, testing that, and seeing how that pans out in practice, I think would be useful, for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
First question is regarding the works of Fergus, Ziller, LeCun, etc. Many of these people had works on multi-layer sparse coding, and this was before CNNs. And then there was a shift of everyone to CNNs, and you being the great figure of sparse coding, I was wondering, what do you think about these works? Any thoughts?
I quite like what they were doing, actually, and it's a shame that track was not further pursued. I've gone back and read those papers myself, thinking because I'd be interested in kind of picking that trail up myself. Actually, I think there's a lot of promise there, and also with, frankly, this early network out of Google Brain that Kwok Lee did with Andrew Ng and that whole group, were the one that they trained on YouTube, and it learned cats and so forth. And it was sort of a primitive sparse coding model. It was basically kind of a stack sparse coding that they were doing. And some interesting things were happening there. I think there's various ways one could sort of approach that to make it work better, or yeah. So I think that those were good directions, and it's sort of unfortunate that they were. Everybody just sort of moved in this big horde, in this, not in your, but they turned in this one direction. And I guess that's what kind of surprises me most about the field right now. There seems to be a lot of sociology that's driving people to do things, as opposed to following one's own instinct, or because there's so many interesting problems to work on. There's so many interesting threads one could pursue here, and it seems like we're all going down this one river instead, and maybe that's one of the, I think, points I'm going to try to make today, is that open up the intellectual landscape and try to expose people to different approaches.
When confronting certain individuals in the computer vision community about why did people stop doing multi-layer sparse coding sort of ideas, pursuing them, they claimed vaguely that sparse coding does not work for classification, but they never reference a specific work. Have you heard such claims and comment about that?
Well, a few things. I mean, sparse coding was never advertised to solve that problem. So, especially in one layer, right? The idea of just taking an image and making a one-layer sparse code of it, I would never think about and saying, okay, now I'm going to put a classifier on that. I was like, well, there's lots more you have to do still, right? And that's kind of what we're working on. But Andrew Ng came along and said, well, let's just try it. Let's take the sparse code and feed that into. He actually took a non-linearly computed sparse code where you minimize L1, actually, right? And then took that sparse code as the front end to the computer vision system and showed it actually beat all the other competing feature representations that they were using at the time. And other people have sort of been showing this too. And it's just before the deep learning wave, with the sort of histogram of features approaches that they were using, instead of doing vector quantization, they used sparse coding, and it worked better. So all those point to the fact that there's a lot of merit in that approach. So. Yeah, exactly. Whenever I hear somebody say, "Oh, yeah, we tried that and it didn't work very well," it's like, well, what does that mean? I mean, what exactly did you try? 20 years ago, people used to say that about neural nets. Oh, yeah, we tried neural nets and it didn't work. Okay, well, it's hard to know what to make of those.
Amen.
Kinds of statements.
The next question is, so we talked about this quite a bit already in the other questions, but can you answer in a single word, optimally, why is the first layer obtaining the same filters as in your work of nature? Why?
Well, I guess I could imagine, the way deep learning came at it is you build this multi-layer neural network, you train it, you percolate the errors backward, and then this emerges as the solution, with the end goal being object recognition. Then you could imagine starting from the unsupervised angle and say, okay, well, today I'm going to build a one-layer neural network and just do sparse coding. And then on top of that, I'm going to add now a second layer and do other kind of feature extraction on that, right? And do it again, and maybe eventually have something that is useful for object recognition. Well, both of those systems kind of work in a similar way now, right? They were learned in different ways. They were sort of derived differently, but the idea is the same in both, that, starting from the raw data, the first thing you want to do is get into a feature space. And the advantage of the arguments, for sparsity, is a way, first of all, going into a higher dimensional space, because typically we're overcomplete in sparse coding. So it's going into a higher dimensional space, and then going to that higher dimensional space in a nonlinear way, right? That actually sort of pushes the data out in different axes, and that's basically what sparse coding is doing. And it's the same idea embodied like Cover's theorem, that when you're in a higher dimensional space, that things are easier to separate, right? So all those motivations, those were all the sort of motivations behind sparsity, and so I think they're probably emerging in the deep net for the same reason. Right, it's a way of taking the raw data, pushing into this higher space, making it sparse, and now the next layer can do something with that. But that's just conjecture. I mean, we need you guys to formalize this, right? Put some math around it.
My next question is: at some point, I was enthusiastically looking at neuroscience on Wikipedia and several articles, and I was thinking about the properties of neurons at later layers of the brain, or you don't use the word layers. Which word do you use to describe? Areas of the brain. Thank you. And I was wondering, could you summarize what neuroscience has come up with regarding properties of neurons in V2, V3, etc.? Is it as easy as in V1, where you can say it's just localized and orientation?
No, it's not even easy in V1, frankly. So it's a really enormous challenge, and it's for several reasons. One is that even in a deep net, right, where you have access to everything, it's hard even there to sort of look at one unit in the network and say, well, what's that unit's feature, right? I mean, Zeiler and Fergus tried one way of visualizing that, but it's really it's hard even in that case to sort of come up with a receptive field for those neurons in the deep net. And so you have that same problem when you're looking at neurons in the brain, but you have an even bigger problem, which is that there's some very strong nonlinear dynamics in there in the brain, these very powerful recurrent neural networks that are intermixing information within a layer, as well as between layers and feedback loops and all these other things going on. So at the end of the day, it's hard to sort of look at one individual neuron sometimes and make sense of it and extract a feature set or something like that. So it's an enormously difficult challenge. But nevertheless, I mean, I think some of the early observations, they're going back to the 70s, where that is you ascend the hierarchy from V1 to V2 to V4 into infratemporal cortex, you find progressively more complex features being represented, right, in some sense, meaning that the neurons will activate, they'll fire more robustly in response to more complex stimuli. Like for a V1, a grating, you can take a grating and drift it over a V1 neuron, and it will fire to that, right? But a neuron in V4 could care less about a grating. It's very hard to drive it with something like that. But if you put sort of a curved stimulus or something with some other complex structure there, that seems to activate the neuron more. And then when you get up to IT, you find neurons that are driven by the presence of a whole face, even a line drawing of a face. But it has to be all the parts of a face together.
So I'm actually not interested in the effective filter. I'm more interested in the weights at the certain layer. Basically, can you say something mathematically about some mathematical property they might satisfy?
Boy. The weights as you ascend the hierarchy.
Yes.
I don't think there's any. There's nothing that one can say right now about the empirical data that exists. Whether you could say something theoretically a priori about how you might expect it to turn out. Again, I have to turn that to you guys.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bruno.
So the essence of a good scientific theory is that it makes predictions long in advance and not with any foreknowledge of what's taking place. And in that light, we have a very interesting talk today, which I think I foreshadowed in the first lecture of this series way back in September. At the very beginning of the deep learning mania in 2012, I went to a talk by Jan LeCun where he talked about all the wonderful properties of deep nets, and then he showed pictures of what features the deep nets were actually trying to measure. And lo and behold, they were Olshausen and field basis functions as near as I could see. And I was very surprised because this is something I had seen emerging in the 90s in the neuroscience literature. There was a movement of people who were saying, let's gather natural scenes and run a certain kind of unsupervised learning algorithm on that, and we will learn how neurons actually get built by humans and other animals. And to kind of carry that out, there was a computational neuroscience project by Bruno, Olshausen, and David Field that had a much-cited paper in Nature describing an unsupervised learning algorithm that produced some very particular basis functions that were quite interesting. And I really think that if you compare that paper in Nature 1996 with any of the many pictures of the first layer of deep learning filter functions that are out there, you'll see a very striking resemblance. So in that sense, I feel that their work really foreshadowed some of what we're seeing here. And of all the theoretical approaches that I know of at the moment, this is the only one that actually made a clear prediction that if you try to learn a basis from image data, there's a certain kind of basis that's going to emerge, and it's going to be multi-scale, multi-orientation, have very particular structures. So I believe that there is some theoretical success already in explaining aspects of deep learning. We have the progenitor of that success here to talk to us today. He's a professor at UC Berkeley at the Redwood Center for Theoretical Neuroscience, and I'm very eager to hear more of what he has to share with us.
Thanks, David. Thanks a lot for having me. It's great to be here. So I'll just start with one perspective that's been put forward out there about the promise of deep learning. And this is one point of view, and I think it's shared by a lot of people, I think, by the CEO of NVIDIA, and of course for all the investors of NVIDIA. It is a new day in many ways. So I'm hoping today to share with you a different perspective. And so I want to start out talking a little bit about how we got here, how we got to this point. And then some of maybe what I see as limitations of the current kind of framework that's being used, and then some suggestions for how to proceed from here that are largely inspired from neuroscience. So let's go back to the beginning to sort of think about how we got here. And the beginning is like the 1950s, when the founders of the artificial intelligence movement were trying to develop this framework for computation and how you could build an intelligent machine. And this quote here is from the proceedings of the original Dartmouth conference in 1956, which is sort of cited as the birth of AI. And what's really neat, this is like the first sentence of the foreword of their book. They were very much inspired by the brain. They were thinking about brains, and that was kind of driving what they were doing. And of course, they sort of took a different path, not sort of modeling the hardware of the brain, because people didn't know much about the brain at that time. And so they instead turned to introspection and thinking about the thought processes and trying to capture the thought processes underlying intelligence and so forth. And that led them in the direction of going towards moving it with largely symbolic computing. But in parallel with that whole movement was another nascent movement that really was trying to look at the hardware of neurons and to try to capture models of that. And even though, again, they didn't know much about the brains either, that didn't stop them from trying to sort of theorize about what you could compute with neurons. And so one of the first works there was the work of Warren McCulloch and Walter Pitts, who developed this kind of logical, sort of a logic gate model of neural computation. And then also Frank Rosenblatt, who sort of took that a step further and developed the perceptron model, a neuron as a weighted sum of inputs, and then going through a threshold nonlinearity, which is the model that we, basically the roots of what we use today. And so interestingly, there was a lot of interaction among these people at the time. So Walter Pitts here was regarded as a genius by many people. Recognized his genius at the time. So besides Warren McCulloch, also Norbert Wiener and John von Neumann had a lot of interactions with Walter Pitts. And in fact, von Neumann, when he was trying to sort of work out the early computer architectures, was inspired by McCulloch and Pitts' work and was sort of thinking about inspiring these early computation models based on neural computation as opposed to the kind of models we see today. And also between Frank Rosenblatt and Marvin Minsky, they went to high school together at Bronx High School of Science. And Marvin Minsky wrote his PhD thesis on a neural network model of computation. So there's a lot of very rich interactions going on in that day. And Walter Pitts, unfortunately, he burned his PhD thesis because he kind of, so what happened is Warren McCulloch and Norbert Wiener sort of got into a fight or tiff or something, and they were both mentors to Walter Pitts, and this sort of sent him into a depression, and he burned his PhD thesis. But he had some very interesting ideas, evidently, he was working on, which we unfortunately won't know about. So it's it was a very interesting time at the beginnings of computation, and people were thinking at this very early time about neurons, about neural computation, about symbolic computation, all this stuff in the 1950s. Really fascinating. And so then just to sort of, kind of go through a brief tour of what happened since then. So this is like the model that Rosenblatt came up with, the perceptron model, modeling a neuron as a summing junction. So they sort of think of these weights as synapses, synaptic strengths, and taking a sum of inputs and then putting that through a threshold nonlinearity. And then he came up with this perceptron learning rule, a learning rule that shows how you could adapt these weights from experience. So you could just train this neuron from many examples to perform a classification task. And here at Stanford, Bernie Woodrow, at the same time, was working with a similar kind of model, except didn't have a threshold nonlinearity, just had a linear output here. And he was using gradient descent to train these weights as a learning rule. Okay, so that was sort of at the same time. And so then they were getting a lot of success with this perceptron model. But then Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert came along with this book called Perceptrons, which leveled a critique against them and saying, well, you're fundamentally limited because the only classification problems you can solve are those which are linearly separable. And unless you could stack these neural networks and come up with a learning rule for multi-layered perceptrons, then this can't really sort of go anywhere. And since you don't have any learning rule, you might as well just sort of give up. And so they knew about gradient descent. So Bernie Woodrow was using gradient descent and stuff. But if you're going to stack them, this is a showstopper to propagating the gradient. And so it took about 20 years for people to realize that you could just smooth that function and then stack the layers and then backpropagate gradients through it, and it works great. And so that was kind of the second wave of neural networks happening in the 1980s, mid-1980s. And then about 20 years after that, so the model we use now in deep learning today, so people realize that with the sigmoid function there, you have like a saturating nonlinearity, and so that's clipping your dynamic range if you're working with things like images and sound. That's not a good thing to do. And so using these sort of linear functions which have more expanded dynamic range, but still nonlinear kind of threshold, is more advantageous. Okay, so but this is basically the neurons that we use today in deep learning, right? They're basically inherited from this very old tradition, originating from Frank Rosenblatt. And the only thing that's changed is what's in that box. Okay, and so in about the same time as meanwhile, while all this stuff was happening, another researcher in Japan was working on a multi-layer neural network model he called the neocognitron. This is Fukushima. Now we associate Fukushima with the nuclear power plant. This is the Fukushima I know, because I read this paper early on. This was one of the first papers I read when I was learning about this stuff, actually when I was a student here at Stanford. So it was a very inspiring model to a lot of people. And he in turn was inspired by what people were finding out about the visual cortex, about the sort of multi-layer architecture and that cascade of feature detection that seemed to be going on in the visual cortex. And so he conceived this model that starts with an image here and has multiple layers of representation and alternating, sort of going between simple cells, which are just simply like linear ReLU units, kind of, and then complex cells, which do a pooling of these simple cells. Okay, this is just like a spatial pooling. So you do feature extraction, filtering, followed by pooling, and then you do another layer feature extraction, and then pooling, and so forth. And this is basically a convolution. So each of these layers is a different feature layer. So these might be sort of Gabor's all oriented one direction. The next thing here. So this is basically what we think of this, like the depth, the feature depth in a deep network. Okay, so I just want to mention this early on because there's a lot of people maybe up for consideration now as the father of deep learning. Many people probably vying for this honor. And in my book, this guy, hands down, is the father of deep learning. Okay, there's just no question. He was way ahead of the game in sort of conceiving of this idea. And so I'll just take you through a little bit of that. So here, this is the rationale for why that might work. So what he was saying is, like, you want to have these feature detectors which at early levels which detect local patterns in the image. Those are like simple cells. And then followed by pooling. And the reason why you're going to do this pooling is to get some degree of invariance, because you want to be able to recognize patterns independent of their specific position or particular deformations in them. Okay, so you can detect these features, but then pool over them to get some degree of invariance. Okay, so that's the pooling idea. And then after you do that pooling, now you can do the layer feature extraction on these invariant features. So these features here are the same as these features here, just more invariant. And now if you look at local combinations of these, you'll get some more global, be able to pick up more global patterns, and eventually be able to recognize the pattern, the global pattern or gestalt independent of positional variations. Okay, so this is the activation rule. And I just want to sort of emphasize here, it has all the ingredients of ConvNet. So this is convolution of some filter with the image. The filter here is A, those are the weights. U is the activities from the layer below that come in the output of the pooling units. It has a ReLU nonlinearity, what today we call a ReLU. And it has divisive normalization as well. So this is what Eero Simoncelli and Jan LeCun and other people have pointed to as a really fundamentally important part of neural network models. He incorporated this divisive normalization idea into his neural network, and he had his own rationalization for why that was important. Okay, so that's the activation rule. Very rich kind of model, and then the learning rule is basically like a local winner-take-all learning rule. So it's a Hebbian learning rule. What he does is among all the feature layers. So this is just sort of taking those different features and stacking them in layers here. and this is positional dimension of the image here. So across the feature dimension, he does a local competition. So you do a local winner take all. That's what he's saying. This is like, text instead of an equation, but it's basically a local winner take all that you perform this. Or I would sort of think of this as like a poor man's sparse coding that you're doing here to get some selectivity. And then when you do this local winner take all, then you just do Hebbian learning to update the weights. So it's completely self-organized. And then out of that, you learn to categorize patterns. So he trained it on digits, just like this, in different positions. So just variable positions and different kind of sizes of these digits, and with corruption and noise like that. And it learns to categorize digits at the top layer of the neural network. And this is just showing how it works when you take an input image, how it's expressed in the first layer. It gives a sort of sparse representation of in terms of features, pools those to get something more invariant, and does another layer of feature extraction, and then pooling, and so forth, and finally gets a single unit here at the top that classifies it as a digit. Okay? So this is deep learning, right? This is the first deep learning model. The only difference between this model and models that are used today is that it was purely self-organized using unsupervised learning as opposed to using gradient descent with a teacher. So in the supervised paradigm, the teacher tells you, okay, turn on that unit when I show you a 4. And then you backpropagate things backwards. But basically, it's the same idea. Okay, so what I want to argue here is that fundamentally, this is not a good model of perception. And I want to sort of take you through the reasons, few of the reasons why. So, and so I think the major mistake that's being made here is this idea of pooling. When you do this sort of pooling over a feature to get this invariance, that was a good thing, but you also did a bad thing at the same time, is that you lost all the information about relative spatial relationships. Okay, so this is, so relative spatial relationships are important, right? These two objects have the same features present, but in different positions. And so if you just sort of pooled over position to get invariance, then you would call these two things the same thing, but clearly we don't recognize them as being the same. So you want to preserve information about relative spatial relationships. The sort of extreme example of that is using the Fourier transform, the amplitude in the Fourier domain as a signature of a pattern, which is kind of a pooling over phase. So in this case, the Fourier basis are your filters, and you're simply pooling over each real and imaginary pair in the Fourier domain to get invariance. And so indeed that can give you an invariant signature. So each of these patterns, when you shift this thing around, it always has the same signature here in the Fourier domain, the amplitude spectrum. But this pattern here also has the exact same amplitude spectrum. Right? So this is the price you pay for pooling, right? You get invariance, but you're too invariant, right? There's too many other things that you can accept. This is obviously an extreme form of pooling because you're using the Fourier basis, which is a global basis. So you might think that problem is somewhat mitigated when you work with more local features. So in this case, I'm just doing the same thing with a Gabor wavelet transform. So the features here, they're not the Fourier basis. It's basically complex Gabors organized in a wavelet pyramid from Irasimoncelli. And if you take an image like this and do a complex Gabor expansion, and now do the same experiment, you locally randomize the phases. So if you're just going to preserve the amplitude only from these groups, and ask what information that contains about the image, this is what you get back. Okay, if you just preserve the amplitude and then just have to randomize the phases to get back. So you can see it says, look, there's some detail here, but the local particulars, the relative spatial relationships are all messed up. Okay, whereas if you do the opposite, if you just keep the phase, if you keep the local phase information and throw away the amplitude, it looks kind of weird, but it retains all the edges and the important things that we consider important about the structure of the image. Okay, so with this in mind, this kind of then explains why we get these strange things happening with adversarial examples. So this is a paper I assume everybody's familiar with from Jeff Kloon and Jason Yosinski and Nguyen, where they basically start, they just sort of a hill climbing in the image space. So they have some feature set they work in, and they're basically trying to create an image, which in this case activates the node in, let's say, AlexNet. Tries to activate the node for an African gray parrot. It tries to just activate that node as maximally as possible, and all the other nodes not at all, right? So the neural net in this case gives a very confident classification that this is an African gray parrot. Okay, so they just perturb the pixels around in a feature space using like an evolutionary algorithm to hunt for things that maximally activate a node. So these are things that that the neural network, that using the same pooling, the pooling that's doing this to you, because the pooling is basically treating the image as a texture. Okay, and indeed that's what we see here. So you sort of get remote control texture, freight car texture, king penguin texture, and so forth. And these are considered by the network to be objects, and these are not mistakes that a human would make. And in some sense, the network is to be congratulated for conceiving of these very sort of abstract renderings of object categories. They're very interesting to look at. Okay, but this is again the price you pay for pooling. Okay, so but you can sort of see why this might still work in the context of object categorization. And I think one insight to that comes from this work of Oda Leva and Antonio Torralba from a while back. And what they showed was just how much information you can get from very cheap computations on the image, like the power spectrum. Okay, so if you just go back to this idea of computing the power spectrum of an image, and if you look at the not only the global power spectrum of the image, but the power spectrum computed globally in local parts of the image, and you look at that as like an overall signature. What they were interested in doing is characterizing different scene types. So when you take a picture, you just want to know, like, is this a picture of an outdoor scene? Is it an indoor scene? Is it a natural scene? Is it a coastline? Is it mountains? Is it forest? Just like the scene gist. And what they showed is you could do a very good job at doing this basic level of scene categorization, scene gist categorization, just using the power spectrum. Okay, so this is just showing that here, that what they're showing here is cross sections of the two-dimensional power spectrum along the radial dimension for coastlines versus buildings versus forests. If you take a whole bunch of images of forests, they all have this kind of characteristic signature in the Fourier domain of how the power changes as a function of frequency at different orientations. Okay, so then if you hand me an image and just compute the signature, I can tell you make a pretty good bet that that's an image of buildings. Okay, and so I guess my theory is that this is basically what deep nets are tapping into. Okay, this is this kind of interesting study because it's saying surprisingly there's a lot of information about the scene category, about the object category that rides along with things like the power spectrum. Okay, things that is very sort of cheap and easy things to compute that you wouldn't think would be good enough for object recognition, but it turns out they're pretty useful. And this is just showing how they can take different scenes and categorize them this way. So coast scenes, countryside, forest, mountains, landscapes, and so forth, along these different dimensions that they compute. They have this sort of feature space they compute with the Fourier transform. Okay, so that's one paradigm of trying to do image recognition, and if all you want to do is sort of classify things roughly, and maybe if you're at Google and you're trying to just sort of, if you don't care if you make mistakes every once in a while, that's good enough. But for people in computational neuroscience, we want to understand the neural basis of perception, like how do brains actually see, and how does the visual cortex form representations of objects that are good enough for behavior in us and other animals. And so what I want to do now is just sort of look a little bit at like what's potentially missing from this model. Okay, so as I mentioned before, this model has very old roots. It's sort of been the same for a long time, and I think from the point of view of many people in neuroscience, there's a lot of ingredients you would want to bring into this model to make it richer, more computationally rich, and maybe express more what we see in biology. And so one would be trying to capture a better model of the neuron itself. Okay, so this is the model this is like a real just an image of a real neuron here. The soma and all its dendrites, going apical dendrites and basal dendrites down here. And so the model we typically use now is you're saying, well, we're going to model all this complexity by just thinking the neuron is computing a weighted sum of inputs and then putting that through a single nonlinearity here at the soma. Okay, so this is the model that Rosenblatt proposed in the late 1950s. Because they didn't know much about how neurons actually work. It seemed like a reasonable starting point. But today we actually know a lot more about how neurons actually work, and they don't work like this. Okay, if there's one thing we know is that that's not a good model of what a neuron does. And the reason why is because each of these dendrites has all kinds of channels in it which lead to nonlinear interactions between inputs. So in other words, when you have inputs converging upon this dendritic tree, it matters where the input comes in as far as how it's going to be combined and what other units are doing around it at the same time. Okay? And so you have things like NMDA channels, which compute local ands. So within a dendritic segment here, you would sort of have like an and kind of function being computed between two inputs, or a shunting inhibition where one input can veto another input coming in. And all those nonlinear combinations can happen locally here within the dendritic tree. So a better model of a neuron, and this is something that people like Bartlett Mell have promoted for quite a while. A better model would be something like what we call a sigma pi model. Sigma pi meaning a sum of products. So these products would be like a local group of inputs. Okay, so this would be G would be just stand for some local region on the dendritic tree, which inputs are coming in and getting sort of this is not a strict mathematical multiply, but kind of a pseudo multiply or and-like, something between a multiply and an and-like combination, and then taking a weighted sum of these local nonlinear combinations, and this would be a better conceptual model of what a neuron does. Now, to some people in neuroscience, that's disturbing because they say, "Oh, geez, that's really complicated. It'd be much better if it was just linear." But from a computational point of view, this is great, right? Because nonlinearity is the essence of computation, right? You need nonlinearities to compute. Okay, so you want this, right? This is something good, and so we should be thinking in computational neuroscience about how to use this, how to exploit this kind of nonlinearity to do something useful. And I'll give you one idea about how to do that in a second. Okay, so another idea I think we want to jettison is this idea of labeled lines. And this is sort of I think originated with the fact that the way things started in neuroscience is by recording from single neurons, and just showing the sort of typical paradigm in neuroscience where you have a single wire, tungsten microelectrode you're sticking in the cortex. You try to get the tip of that electrode near a neuron. And so when that neuron fires an action potential, it's recorded by this electrode, and then you can sort of study what it does in response to some stimulus. And this was really the main paradigm in neuroscience for a long time. And so this paradigm kind of led us into a single neuron way of thinking about how the brain works. And in many papers that are published today, you see people making statements like, okay, this neuron does this. This neuron is reporting the presence of this feature, or this neuron is signaling the salience of a stimulus and reporting it to this other area, and things like that. Okay, and this sort of idea, maybe one of the sort of early works you could tie to that is this paper called with the title "What the Frog's Eye Tells the Frog's Brain," with Walter Pitts also as one of the co-authors. And so they were studying these different neurons in the frog's eye, and here's just sort of the way they sort of thought about it. There are 4 types of fibers, each type concerned with a different sort of pattern. So the idea is each neuron reports some signal about something going on in the world. It's like a feature detector. Okay, so you have all these feature detectors, and they're each sending some message to the brain. And this is a very sort of traditional way of thinking about how neurons work, and I sort of grew up thinking about things this way, and so it's an idea, even though I know it's incorrect, I can't get it out of my own head sometimes. But it's very much ingrained in thinking a lot of neuroscience. But again, there's a lot of reasons to think the brain does not work this way. This is not the right way of thinking about it. And the reason why is because when you get into areas like the cortex, neurons are highly connected in high-dimensional groups. Okay, so you have large numbers of neurons, in the order of maybe 1,000 to 10,000 neurons, which are interconnected together in what people sometimes call a cell assembly. So the important things to think about here might not be what individual neurons are doing, but with the joint activity of a very large population of neurons. Okay, and there's a lot of recent work showing maybe sort of the presence of things like attractors, this work of Cunningham and Churchland and so forth. And that when you look at the joint space of many neurons, you start to see interesting structures here that you can correlate to perceptual or motor or cognitive variables that you wouldn't be able to make sense of from single neurons. Okay, and part of the reason why this is happening is because in the cortex you have this very rich intermixing of information. So this is just showing a cross-section of cortex, so that we know that cortex is layered. Okay, so it's not just kind of like a bunch of mush in there, one type of neuron. There are many different types of neurons within any part of the cortex. And these neurons are organized into a circuit, and that circuit really varies by layer. So there's one circuit here in layer 4 that interconnects neurons when inputs come in, and then the neurons in layer 4 feed up to layers 2 and 3. This is kind of a schematic of this canonical wiring diagram within a cortical region. And layer 2, 3 in turn projects back to layers 5 and 6, and it sort of goes around a loop like this. But one of the most fascinating parts of this circuit to me are these neurons in layer 2 and 3. and they're very strongly connected in a recurrent loop. So what this means is that even if the information comes into this region in terms of labeled lines, so that, like in V1, the fibers coming into layer 4 are coming from LGN, which in turn is relaying information from the retina, you might be able to think of those as labeled lines reporting the presence of an edge or some feature at different parts of the image. All this information is getting strongly intermixed up here within layer 2, 3. So by the time it's been so strongly intermixed with other neurons from other parts of the image, it's hard to sort of think about the message that any one of these neurons is conveying, right? Because it's really it has a lot of strong nonlinear dynamics to it, and it's functioning together as a population. Okay, so how exactly that works, we don't know, but it just sort of leads one to think that we have to sort of think about high-dimensional populations, not single neurons, as being the fundamental elements. And another thing that makes life interesting is the very strong feedback loops between areas. So this is just illustrating some of those, starting with the retina here. So the pathway going from the retina to the LGN and the thalamus, that's kind of a one-way pathway. But that's the exception. From there on, there's very strong feedbacks everywhere. So the LGN is a nucleus in the thalamus that relays visual information to the cortex. So this is like the first visual area in cortex, the primary visual cortex. And that in turn does some processing on the image and sends that to area V2, which does some more processing and so forth down the line. This is sort of like the inspiration for deep learning, sort of higher levels of abstraction going on in the system. But as you'll see here, the information is certainly not just sort of feed forward going from input to output here. There's feedback connections going from higher levels back to lower levels. Okay, so what that means is very interesting. Just think about it this very earliest stage here. If you're a neuron in the LGN, what this neuron in the LGN is sending to cortex is not just repeating the retinal image. It's basically sending a combination of data coming in from the world and what the brain thinks is going on. Okay, so the brain has some idea of what it thinks is going on in the world, and it's sending that down to LGN, modifying these neurons. And so the message that's being sent to the cortex is not just some kind of veridical representation of data. It's already mixed and influenced by hypotheses or something else going on in the brain. And as well, you have these very complicated, interesting connections between the thalamus and the cortex. So the thalamus and the cortex are strongly interconnected. And so there's basically a hierarchy within the pulvinar region, the part of the thalamus that reflects this hierarchy here. Okay, and what this thalamocortical loop is doing and how it influences this whole processing stage is still largely unknown. Okay, so there's a lot of richness here which biology offers us, and which to me is very inspiring, and I hope to many others. I think there's a lot of very interesting and very rich computational questions to be asking here and to get inspired by in terms of trying to improve what these networks do. Okay, so I'm going to just give you two examples of specific kinds of models that maybe capture some of this structure. And one is this idea of dynamic routing, and the other is this idea of hierarchical Bayesian inference. So let's just first talk about this idea of dynamic routing. So this idea of dynamic routing is trying to get around this idea of pooling. Okay, and this is something that Jeff Hinton has been talking about recently, also with his capsules model. And in fact, I was looking at one of his slide decks recently on the capsules, and he has a slide in there that says, "This is why deep learning is doomed." And it's because of the pooling issue, okay? And capsules fix that, okay? And capsules are about trying to establish reference frames when you extract features and when you pass information from one layer to the next. You want to think about not just sending on the presence of a feature, but something about its local position and how it aligns with some object you're looking for, okay? So that's the idea here we're trying to get at with dynamic routing. And there's a couple ways to kind of motivate this, and there's a lot of examples from psychology where we see that these reference frame effects are very influential in perception. So this is just a very simple example where we have the same shape here, but seen in two different contexts, you classify it very differently. So here you sort of see this as a diamond, and here most people would call that a square. And the reasoning here is because these surrounding objects, these surrounding circles, even though they don't have anything to do with that, they establish locally a reference frame for that object. Okay, because the vertical structure here of these two things, they establish a vertical reference frame. And so this shape, when seen in this vertical reference frame, you classify as a diamond. This shape here, when seen in a diagonal reference frame, you would call that a square, because that's the reference frame that shape is most naturally described in. Okay, so that's the idea that objects have kind of a canonical reference frame they're described in, and then what you're trying to do is establish some correspondence between the reference frame you have for that object in memory and how it appears in the image. And this is something that the brain must be trying to do. This is another just fun example of these reference frame effects from ATNIA from a long time ago. So a triangle here, equilateral triangle, it could be pointing in one of three directions, is of course arbitrary. But when you surround it in context with all these other triangles, what you'll notice here is that it will sort of flip on you spontaneously. So if you assign one of those triangles to be pointing in one direction, all the other triangles point in the same direction. Do you notice that? They kind of go together, right? You can't sort of see each triangle with its own reference frame. So again, it's not proof, it's just kind of suggestion that there's something about reference frames that are important in how we describe shapes in the brain. And then maybe a signal about the reference frame that's being passed around here. Okay, so Hinton actually had a model early on for doing this. This is a kind of dynamic routing model, and actually this paper was in part the inspiration for my PhD thesis for working on this dynamic routing stuff. And so in this model that Jeff Hinton proposed a long time ago, the idea is that you have this idea is sort of like a traditional deep network. You have features which are extracted down here in the image. So these are just like local features that are extracted from the image. And then these are some higher order features at a higher level, which these feed into. And then these feed into objects up here. So there's more complex objects which these features feed into. Okay, these are simple letter shapes, so that H is composed of these two vertical strokes and a horizontal stroke here. But importantly, the units at this level are described within an object-based reference frame. Okay, so this unit here signals the presence of a vertical stroke on the left side of the reference frame. This unit here signals the presence of a horizontal stroke in the middle of the reference frame, and so forth. So given those spatial relationships, then these three parts would uniquely feed into that object to support the presence of that H. Okay, so now given some feature that occurs in the image, the challenge is to figure out how to map that feature into this object-based reference frame up here. Okay, so there's lots of different ways you could do that, right? So if you wanted to get this feature here up to here, well, it could be mapped to that feature there through one rotation, or to that feature there through a different rotation, and so forth. So you have a set of remapping units here, and what these units are doing is essentially trying to instantiate the transformation between the reference frame down here and the reference frame up here. Okay, so they're basically instantiating a transformation. So when you activate these units here, they come in here with multiplicative synapses and effectively gate these connections so that any one of these units then is being activated by only a portion of these, depending on which of these remapping units is being activated. Okay, so that was an early proposal of Hinton, and interestingly, in this paper, there's no simulation of this model. It's just simply like, hey, here's an idea. Maybe there's one way of thinking about how this could be happening in a neural system, but it's a fascinating idea, right, and a very rich one. And later, they simulated another paper in 1985, and so here's another sort of instantiation of that idea. Of trying to do that. So this is the work I did for my PhD thesis together with David Van Essen and Charlie Anderson. So the idea is that you're trying to, again, to form a representation of an object up here within an object-based reference frame, and that's what's fed to memory. So you have kind of a memory of objects which exists in the object-based reference frame, and then you're taking however that object appears within the scene and routing it into this object-based reference frame to do recognition independent of position or size variations or other geometric transformations that might be occurring. Okay, to do that gating, then we have a set of control units. So these control neurons make multiplicative synapses here to effectively gate these connectivities. And then the proposal was that these control neurons in turn could be driven by bottom-up by a saliency map, which is coming up with maybe good bottom-up proposals of where to focus attention, or top-down by trying to maximize the correspondence between the pattern down here and a pattern up here. Okay, so this is the idea, maybe sort of fleshed out a little more. So you can construct a dynamic routing circuit, which is like basically a multi-layer neural network with a specific kind of architecture. So you have local connections down here and more global connections up here. And that allows any given unit up here to have access over a very large range of inputs. And so by effectively, by gating these connectivities in the right way, we can essentially focus attention. So if we want to take that pattern here and map it up into the object recognition area up here, or this pattern down here, the same pattern but at a different position and scale, by effectively gating these connections in the right way, we can establish that correspondence. Okay, so how do you do that? How do you go about, I keep on talking about gating, so let's just talk a little bit about how that's done. So here's the idea, sort of teased apart a little more. We have a set of input units here, a set of output units up here. You can just think of this as like connections between layer 1 and layer 2 of a neural network. And now the difference is that we're saying instead of these units just computing a fixed weighted sum of, instead of the outputs computing a fixed weighted sum of the inputs, these weights are being dynamically modified by these control neurons over here. Okay, so these control neurons are coming in and making multiplicative synapses. Okay, so if we just take this term here for Wij and put it into there, then what we get is this multiplicative combination between Ck and Ij. Okay, so how would that be done by a real neuron? Well, as I just mentioned before, real neurons can do this kind of thing, right? They can actually do local multiplies within the dendritic tree. Okay, so this is something a real neuron could do. So it fits, and this is something useful that you could do with that. Okay, is instantiate transformations. Okay, so so the challenge then is to set up these connections, these three-way weights. So gamma ij is basically now like a three-way weight, and what it tells us is how much the kth control neuron modulates the ith jth synapse, the synapse between the jth input node and the ith output node. Okay, so gamma ij is now like a three-way weight. So our challenge now is to learn these three-way weights, gamma. Okay, so this is just one way of visualizing that, the connection space between between a set of inputs and a set of outputs. This is the set of all possible connections. And now if we want to instantiate just different translations, it's a matter of enabling a certain band of connections within this connection space. Okay, so that would basically map all these units here one for one onto these output nodes. By simply translating this band of activated connections back and forth here, that would basically translate the wind of attention here. Or if we take this band of enabled connections and simply sort of tilt it more obliquely, then that would implement a scaling transform. So that would basically scale all these inputs onto these output nodes and so forth. Okay, so there's a way of doing that, and we sort of, in this work, we designed this by hand, but I think this is actually something you could learn potentially to optimally, so that each of these control neurons has some band of connections. So the problem of implementing the right transformation is one of generating patterns, basically generating the right set of patterns in this connection space. So essentially what we want to do is learn a good basis for generating these different transformations in the connection space. Okay, and then so the one way then to sort of control the system in a fully autonomous manner is shown here. So this is just showing the full system where you have a set of input nodes here being dynamically routed into a set of memory units up here. So up here we have canonical representations of objects stored within an object-based reference frame. And in this model, it's just in a hop field memory to store these patterns. And then the weights from any one of these nodes to the input are dynamically gated by these control neurons. And the control neurons, in turn, are driven by the correspondence between the units within the memory and the inputs, the input units here. Okay, so these two, what these units here are doing are basically correlating, computing the correlation between patterns up here and patterns down here, and trying to figure out which neurons to turn on to instantiate a certain transformation which has maximal correspondence between the pattern down here and pattern up here. Okay, so it's basically a way of doing pattern matching. Okay, and this is essentially the similar kind of idea of what Hinton's trying to do with capsules. Okay, so I'm just trying to put this out here. This is I think a very rich form of computation, something that's very much needed in a deep learning architecture, and a way of exploiting the richness of what biophysics can give us in neural mechanisms. Here's just an example of that working. So if we take a pattern here, feed it to the system. It sort of converges. It has to. These are the control neurons trying to figure out how to route this pattern into the memory up here. And it can converge on the right classification, and then you can change the size of the pattern, and it still finds the correspondence between this pattern and the memory. Okay, and then finally, one thing I just want to mention is that there was a way to sort of view this in the context of what people currently do in deep nets, which is in terms of max pooling. So you can view the max pooling as a form of routing because you're doing a selection, right? So, but the only difference is that that selection is done in a greedy fashion. You're doing that selection just by looking at units in your local neighborhood and figuring out which is the max, and you're just sending that. And this is when you think of this as a routing circuit, then what it sort of leads you to is that, well, in addition to sending forward the maximum value, I also want to save the state of this control unit that did that switching, right? So that's what they do here. So they save the location of the winning unit, so that you can think of like the control neurons that are doing the routing. And when you save that information, that's what allows them to visualize what these units up here are selective to in the image. And so when they do this unpooling, when they go backwards and try to visualize what any one of these units is doing, they essentially send that activity back down to the network through all these different routing paths that they saved here, and that allows them to then visualize, make these visualizations of these patterns that are being learned at different layers of the network. So these are layer 2 and layer 3. I assume everyone's seen these, but the point is that what allows us to make these visualizations is thinking of max pooling as a routing information and saving the route, the routing state as an important source of information. Okay, I'm moving quickly because I want to get to the next point, and I'm happy to ask questions about these if people want to follow up. And that's. The other thing that I think is missing here is thinking about, well, what is the problem that perception is trying to solve? And right now, I think people are approaching the problem as a classification problem. And what I'm going to argue is that what the brain is trying to do is solve more of an inference problem, which is a much more general problem. You can do classification once you've done inference, but it's a much more general problem being solved. So here's one way of looking at it. Is just like this is kind of the traditional approach in computer vision, even prior to deep learning. Like the way sort of people pose the problem is taken, given an image like this, that we want to classify it. So you might say, okay, that's an image of a baby. And then if you're going to get more specific, you say, well, okay, fine. There's a head here, there's a hand here. So draw boxes around different regions of the image and label them. Okay. And this is sort of like representative of many of the challenge problems and computer vision. And so this is something we can do as humans. We can do this, but we can do a lot of other things with the image too. And this task is not really what we evolved to do. We evolved to do a different thing with scenes. We needed to move around the environment, to grab things in the environment, and lots of things beyond being able to just classify things in the scene. So there's a lot of richness here in the scene that would just be very hard to label, right? So you can perceive aspects of what this person's wearing, these grass in the field, whether it's healthy grass or dry, or the flowers. You could sort of reach down and imagine sort of picking up one of these blades of grass. There's tons of detail here which lives inside your head. And it would be very difficult to sort of get that out of your mouth as a label, right? There's a lot of very rich structure there that lives just inside your head. And language is kind of a very limited bottleneck to kind of get that information through. So that's one thing I think to keep in mind. If we're trying to build good models of perception, then we sort of need to get away from this linguistic bottleneck and think about modeling processes that are occurring internally inside the head. And so here's another example of that. So how many of you seen this image before? Just one? Okay. Good trial audience. Okay, so this is an image of something. And how many of you can see what's here? There's a figure in the scene. If you can't, don't say what it is. Any guesses? Okay, no, good. Well, okay, so no guesses? Okay, well, totally, what's that? Dinosaur. Okay, well, close, actually. Well, okay, so So if you give this image to a subject and ask them to draw what they see, this is what they draw. At least one particular subject. Is this what you would draw? Does that seem reasonable? Like if you asked you to draw a line drawing, let's say, just a line drawing of the image. Okay, fine. That's what you draw. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you what's in the scene. There's an animal here. It's not a dinosaur. It's an animal. And it's a cow. And this is the head of the cow. And then there's a nose here and eyes. You guys see the cow? Okay. So this is interesting. So now you ask the subject, once they see the cow, now you ask them to draw, what do you see? And this is what they draw. Okay. So the question is, where did that come from? So this is just a literal interpretation of the pixels. Here you're just reporting the pixel data, right? But what goes on in your head is you develop a model of what you think is there in the environment. You have some kind of interpretation. And this is just an example of what you're doing all the time. You're doing it right now as you look around this room, right? And examples like this allow us to point out this phenomenon and make it very explicit, because it happens so automatically, you're not aware of it, right? But it's a story making, it's an interpretation that your brain is doing all the time with real data. And it has to do, it works here because we made this kind of grainy image. We introduced some ambiguity. But images as they appear in the retina are also very grainy. They're incomplete, they're noisy, they're unstable, right? And so if you could see the image that was present in your retina, you would be horrified. Okay, that's image quality, right? And so you have this, this sort of feeling that you're looking at this very clear three-dimensional world, right? And this is largely comes from inside you, the model that you build about this data about the world. Okay, so this is interesting to think about. So how do you get at this, right? This is kind of what we want to study in perception. Where does this kind of representation live inside the brain, and how do you compute that? Okay, it's much more than a label. It's much more than a cow, right? That you're experiencing when you look at this. Here's another example. So you don't even need to go things as remote, as sort of complicated as a cow to illustrate this. This is a very simple image of a cube painted in 2 shades of gray. And this was devised by Ted Adelson to illustrate a brightness illusion. So the fact that this patch P looks like it's darker than this patch R. Okay? So how many see that, would agree that that patch P looks darker than the patch R? Okay, so they're actually exactly the same brightness. Okay? If you just measure with a photometer, they're exactly the same. And the reason why they look different to you is for a sensible reason, that when you look at this image, you're trying to factorize it into its underlying causes. And there's 2 things going on here contributing to the different grade levels in these different patches here. Okay, one is the paint on the object, its reflectance. Okay, there's 2 different reflectances here on this object. And the other is the shading, and that's due to its 3-dimensional geometry. Okay, the 3-dimensional shape of the object and how much light these facets reflect depending on their orientation with respect to the light hitting it. Okay, so it's these 2 factors together, and they literally multiply to give this image here. Okay, so when you look at this image, what you effectively have to do to understand this, to understand what's going on, right? Anybody could look at this and sort of understand it, and we all kind of understand what that is. But to make sense of that, you effectively have to go back and demultiply. From the pixel values, go back and figure out, okay, yeah, there's this going on and there's that going on, right? And this is what you experience as what we want to know about is the object. What we want to know about is the physical properties of the object in the world, not just the vertical intensity coming in, right? So how do you do that, right? Because you can't just do that from local information. So if you just considered a bunch of filters looking at this image, like consider how this sort of gets treated by a deep neural network that's just applying filters across the image and then feeding that to a bunch of other filters and feeding that to a bunch of other filters, how is it ever going to tease apart these different underlying causes and the fact that these different edges mean very different things? So just consider this edge between Q and R. That edge between Q and R is physically identical to this edge here, except for the polarity of contrast. Okay, the polarities are different, but otherwise the contrast is the contrast magnitude is the same and the orientation is the same. So those two edges are exactly the same. If you just applied a little Gabor filter there, you would get exactly the same response. But those two edges mean completely different things. This edge corresponds to a change in paint. This edge is purely due to geometry. Okay, so anybody looking at this scene understands that. This must be part of your representation. Where does that exist in the brain? How do you compute that from an image? Clearly, it's not something you can just compute bottom up. You can't just build a filter, a local filter that's going to look at that and compute that because it's ambiguous. You have to somehow combine information from different parts of the image to do that. Okay, so this leads to this way of thinking about vision as an inference problem, right? It's not about sort of just computing a category, but trying from this image data, we're trying to create some kind of a story, a model of what we think is happening in the world. And this story, this model could be very rich in its complexities. You've seen with these examples. It can be a very, very rich model, much more than you could ever get out of your mouth and describe with a few words. Okay? And so one thing, I've been thinking about a lot, and a lot of other people in the field too, maybe, I think, have been thinking about is trying to understand perception in this framework and trying to understand what's happening in the cortex and how you build neural networks that do this. And one very influential idea that's been put out there is by Tai-Sing Lee and David Mumford from a while back, and they proposed this idea of hierarchical Bayesian inference. Okay, so as a way of thinking about these different areas of the cortex as you march up the ventral stream going from V1 to V2 to V3 and V4 and so forth, as performing kind of an inference and basically passing messages. So initially in V1, you might have some initial hypotheses about the presence of an edge. You say, well, okay, fine, I see an edge here, but I'm not sure. It could be a reflectance edge, could be a shading edge, or I see motion here. The motion could be horizontal, or could be vertical. Okay, and you express that ambiguity initially. In the first pass, you sort of come up with your initial hypotheses and your uncertainties about those, and you pass that to the next layer. And the next layer has the advantage of having a more global view because you're integrating information from more parts of the scene, then can try to combine that with its priors to come up with a more parsimonious explanation of what's going on, and then go back into V1 and actually modify these activities. They basically propose this in terms of particles, so they use particle filtering to represent these probability distributions. So you go back and modify these neural activities which are representing these particles to kind of prune out all the false hypotheses and try to amplify the correct hypotheses and let the system settle upon a solution to interpret an image. Okay? So it's a very different way of thinking about how information processing is occurring in the system, and also the goal of the system. It's not in the service of producing a label here, but trying to infer underlying causes of the data. And also, importantly, it utilizes these feedback connections. Okay, feed forward as well as feedback connections between different areas. Okay, so again, this isn't really in strong contrast. So this is kind of the model I'm saying, look, we need to kind of move beyond this idea of just thinking about this whole network as just like a nonlinear function approximation. And all in sort of in this current framework, all these intermediate levels are in service of the top box. Right? It doesn't really matter what's going on here. We just have the input coming out here, and all that really matters is what's coming out here. And yeah, there's some stuff in between, but that's just to kind of build a rich nonlinear function, and which is the answer, right? And so what I'm proposing here is maybe a different framework, a different way of viewing these hierarchical or deep networks. And ultimately, we want to sort of think about this in terms of a full sensory motor system, because what the brain is really dealing with simultaneously is not just sensor data, sensors from images and auditory information and touch information, so it gets all this sensory data, but it's also producing actions. Okay, so it has a bunch of motor neurons that are producing actions. We're agents that live in the world, we move around the world, and as we move around in the world, we change the sensory data that comes in. Okay, so this is really a sort of, I think, important way of thinking about the system. So we have hierarchies that process sensory data. Like in the visual cortex, we have a hierarchy. In the auditory cortex, we have a hierarchy that processes sensory data. But also in the motor systems, we have hierarchies as well. Okay, so we have high-level motor areas and lower-level motor areas that are more sort of directly connected to actuators. And interestingly, we see very strong connections between all of these different levels of control. So in the standard paradigm, you might think, well, what I have to do is, take my sensory data, I go through my neural network until I get to the top box up here. And once the top box tells me, oh, that's a face, then I decide what to do in the motor system to move towards it or away from it or whatever. And then I sort of percolate down through some loop. And what this says is that we want to think about the system fundamentally in terms of nested loops. And so in that sense, what we want to think about is that this system is trying to always estimate some state about the world. It has some representation of state about the world. And that state representation can occur at multiple levels of abstraction. Okay, so it can occur down here at very low levels, things that are describing sort of details of what it sees in the world, or very high-level abstract descriptions of the world. And all of these levels of description might be needed and useful for driving behavior in various ways. Okay, so we want to think about all these levels and the richness that's contained in them all together. All right, so that's really kind of the main points I want to get through. So I think that the bottom line is that multilayer perceptrons are a great idea, but we need to get beyond it, and I think the field actually has gotten beyond that. The neocognitron was a good idea in the 1980s, but it's basically what we're working with today. All these deep learning models, ConvNets that are out there are basically neocognitrons, and I think we need to move beyond that. And to me, I think the way to move forward is, first of all, beyond just thinking about like richer models of neurons and other sort of things we can put in, is like, what problem are we trying to solve in the first place? This is, I think, very important in terms of framing how you approach it. It's like, what is the end goal here? So instead of just saying, oh, I need to solve ImageNet better, well, if we're trying to understand brains, then maybe it's a different kind of problem that we need to understand. So thinking about what the problem is that needs to be solved, this is almost like a PhD thesis in itself, right? It's not obvious, actually, with how to sort of write down the problem statement, and then really sort of think about this computational richness that we see in biology, not only in individual neurons and how they compute, but entire circuits. And the two examples I've offered here that I think could start to get at this is, one is this idea of dynamic routing and carrying information about reference frames and using that to do recognition, and also this idea of hierarchical Bayesian inference. All right, I'm happy to take questions.
So online, a lot of questions have been posted. So I think what Hatef and I will do is just drill into some of those. A fairly common thread that I see in some of the questioning comes from students who are very interested in your paper, Perception as an Inference Problem. And they point to the quote that you give: the properties of the world that are needed to drive behavior are not given directly by the sensory receptors, but instead must be inferred by combining sensory data together with prior knowledge. How is prior knowledge formed and updated? This seems like a task humans are particularly good at. Can understanding this process of prior creation inform development of new algorithms that are not as dependent on massive amounts of training data? That's from Daniel Kunin.
Cool. Yeah, this question comes up whenever you start to invoke Bayesian inference in priors. Is the first question is, where do the priors come from? And I think there's definitely ways of learning those. And so through the maximum likelihood, just like trying to fit a probabilistic model to data. And in part, we've shown that, like, for example, with the sparse coding model, you can think of the sparsity term in sparse coding as a prior. And what we and others have shown is that you can actually learn that prior from the data. So if you didn't know it was supposed to be sparse, you can parameterize that and show that that actually emerges from the data as a good prior. So it's definitely possible to, that's a very simple prior to learn. But I've sort of come to believe that, assuming the cortex is doing something like this hierarchical Bayesian inference, a lot of these priors were probably born with, or they're very strongly predisposed in there, and maybe what development has to do is more fine-tune those. And some evidence for that just comes from other animals. So humans are very unique in that we're born helpless. And we have this period, of several months before we're sort of operational. But many other animals, within hours after being born, these are mammals, right? They're running off across the plain. They can avoid obstacles. They can run away from predators, which is very important for them. They have to navigate a three-dimensional world. They can perceive surfaces. They can do all these things, which is amazing. I mean, it's just like practically literally no training at all. And so this is a cortex that's doing that. So it's and you just look at all the structure in the cortex. So it sort of led me to believe that probably a lot of it is in there. So I think it's an important question to sort of think about how you can learn these priors. But one of the main challenges I think we face right now is just to get these models to work. This model that Tai-Sing Lee and David Mumford laid out, I think is a great framework. But now how do you actually implement that in practice and make it do something practical? And if we could do that, I think that would be a good starting point to then think about how do we actually learn these from experience.
So a connected set of questions concern, if you want to be Bayesian, are there some potential neuronal mechanisms by which Bayesian priors and reasoning are literally encoded in the brain? Can you share some ideas how that would be happening?
Yeah. So again, lots of people actually have been trying to get at this this question. So people like Alex Pouget, Rich Zemmel, Peter Dian have offered some models from a while back, and then Tai-Sing Lee and David Mumford are proposing that these probabilities are represented by particles. Other people like Pietro Berkes and Mattei Legniol have proposed that they're represented by sampling from probability distributions. So that the apparent noise that you see in neural activity, what that's really doing is sampling from priors. There's like samples coming out of a distribution. So these are sort of different models that have been put out there for how probabilities are implemented and how neural circuits can do sort of Bayesian computations. So it's work in that area. I don't have, anyways.
And another set of questions concerned, is there one specific way in which you would try to improve what people are doing in deep learning? Some hack or circuit or gadget that you would throw in there? The first one is, it's not a hack, but dynamic routing, right? I think that's like one of the main things. Yeah. It's instead of doing max pooling, put a routing circuit in there. So that's, yeah.
So Vin is asking, since you mentioned that standard perception benchmarks in computer vision and speech recognition are in general enough to capture human-level general intelligence, are there any tasks from biological inferential processes that might be better suited? Is there any task that you will recommend to work on?
Yeah, well, let's see. Was the premise of the question that these current tasks do or don't capture general?
Don't.
Yeah, right.
That's what you told us.
Right. So what are the tasks that do? And so as I'm saying, that it's first of all, I just want to say it's really a non-trivial problem in its own right to figure out what those tasks should be. But to first order, I think thinking about how to reason in complex three-dimensional environments is one of them. So I think working with robots and that have to move around in a world is going to be very instructive for us in terms of thinking about the right kinds of representations that have to be learned. It's going to challenge us in the right way to do this. But so yeah, I think that's.
So another question coming from Khashayar asking, can you give some suggestions on whether it is practically useful and possible to look for methods for finding the global optimum of the sigma pi model that you mentioned in your talk? Do you know of any paper that has studied this model in deep learning?
In the context of deep learning, no, but certainly I would steer them to Bartlett Mell's work. And he has some learning rules that he's derived for these sigma pi units. One he calls the clusteron. But when you go to the sigma pi domain, one reason why it's not been done much It's because it just explodes on you, the complexity. And then you have to think, if where you come into a dendrite matters, now the search over the weight space, is just explodes. Now, so you have to somehow constrain yourself. And the way this gets constrained in the brain is by three-dimensional proximity, right? So that you can only form a synapse where two fibers are sort of coming within range that they can actually touch each other, right? So that rules out a lot of potential combinations. So that might be one way to go about doing it. But Bartlett and Mel has this idea of the clusteron, where you sort of stochastically sort of try a connection, then you pull back, and you sort of try it and sort of maybe stochastically search around the space.
So as a last question here, I'm going to ask, Ken Wong is asking, when training neural nets, people usually use dropout training, which is to delete some nodes or neurons in a network randomly. Are there some intuitive explanations about why dropout training works from the perspective of neuroscience?
I guess we have neuroscience. I'm not sure. I guess I would sort of just go back to the view that a lot of people have echoed within the deep learning community of why it works, and that seems to be, so you could sort of view it as a kind of way of doing stochastic.
Do you think brain is doing dropout?
Who knows? It could be doing lots of things. It's certainly implausible, right? I don't see any reason why not.
Okay.
And I mean, one thing we see that brains do, which is very interesting, is when they develop, they go through this period of cell proliferation, where you proliferate neurons and develop lots of connections, and then they prune away. There's a period of cell death. And so there's all kinds of these tricks that are happening in the system, and yeah.
So maybe we get one or two questions from the audience, if there is any question. You have a question?
I guess so. You had flagged these adversarial examples as a nice demo of the shortcomings of current approaches. I was just wondering, practically, if these different examples you're giving, do they perform better with respect to adversarial examples?
Haven't been done. So everything I've told you about these sort of, they haven't been built yet at scale, let's say, right? This was sort of like tinkering around in my PhD thesis. So Jeff Hinton is trying to advance this idea now through capsules. Tyson Lee and David Mumford sort of put out the sketch of an idea there, but these have yet to be built like at full scales to really sort of test them in that way. But I'm willing to bet lots of money, lots of my own hours put into this that they will. Yeah, because the idea, if you have more of like a generative model, then it's going to be very hard for that system to get fooled by adversarial examples, because it's doing a sanity check. It's saying, look, this is why I think there's a penguin there, right? This is my model of a penguin. This is the correspondence I see. So it's trying to actually fit, when you're trying to fit a model to data, it's going to be much harder to get fooled by some other sort of spurious collection of features.
Although we got fooled by the cow.
Let's see. Well, you didn't think the cow was a penguin, right? You just didn't know, right? And the point there is you have ambiguity. It's not so much, yeah, that's right. Well, sure, we get fooled as well, but in different ways, yeah. Then I would argue that the ways we get fooled are more consistent with a generative model kind of fitting data as opposed to a bunch of filters in a network, yeah.
Other questions? Well, if there's no further questions, let's thank our speaker.
Thanks.